In the history of piston aviation of the Second World War, from its very beginning to its very last day, the tendency of rapid improvement of flying machines is vividly traceable. And there is nothing surprising in this, for the outcome of any conflict, especially one as great as the largest military confrontation in history, is determined to a large extent by the competition between the designers of the opposing sides. Thus, outdated solutions had no place on the battlefield. Not quite, and defending this position is the hero of my story today, a biplane of the company Fairey Aviation, bearing the sonorous name Swordfish. Friends, you are on the channel, The Grand Archive. I wish you pleasant viewing. Sitting down to design his next airplane, Marcel Lobel could hardly have realized that at that very moment, from under his pen was born one of the most significant British winged machines of the 20th century, and the engineer could well be understood. Bound by the strict requirements of his employer, Lobel in the early 1930s was once again forced to design an aeroplane according to the old-fashioned biplane scheme. And all because, according to the company's plan, the markets for the future machine were initially seen exclusively as the armed forces of developing countries, which placed low cost and ease of maintenance at the forefront, and not at all outstanding flight and technical characteristics. So it is no wonder that at the basis of the designed aircraft lay a time-tested truss of steel tubes, carefully covered with duralumin sheets and partly with fabric. The wings, for convenience of storage and transportation, were made foldable, and in the open cockpit there was room for the pilot, the navigator, and the gunner radio operator, whose duty was the defense of the rear hemisphere with a single infantry-caliber machine gun. Another such machine gun was mounted on the right side near the pilot. It is obvious that all this, so to speak, armament was intended purely for defense. The main offensive means was considered to be an aerial torpedo slung under the belly, or bombs with a total mass of up to 730 kilograms. For quite a long time they could not decide on the power plant, for the role of which motors of liquid and air cooling simultaneously contended. In the end, the choice fell on the latter, as requiring less attention. Thus, the heart of the future aeroplane became the 9-cylinder radial Bristol Pegasus 3M, with a power of 635 horsepower. The calculations were completed at the beginning of 1933, and at that time the customer was also determined. It turned out to be the Air Force of Greece, which was looking for a replacement for its already quite worn-out Fairey 3F. Meanwhile, in the aviation units of the British fleet, the concept of a multi-purpose aircraft, capable of simultaneously performing reconnaissance and torpedo bombing missions, was gaining more and more supporters. In the creation of such a machine, the military saw a good opportunity to reduce the nomenclature of models used on deck, which obviously simplified the repair and servicing of aircraft under conditions of a permanent shortage of spare parts that inevitably arose on floating airfields far from home. As is not difficult to guess, it was precisely Marcel Lobel's Greek airplane that fully met all the above-described requirements. That is why the admirals of the misty Albion suddenly treated the unpretentious novelty of Fairey aviation with undisguised interest. Moreover, a competition was in fact organized retroactively especially for it, thereby ensuring the firm and easy victory. What can one say? Apparently, the economic crisis of the early 1930s had painfully struck even the mistress of the seven seas. Despite the seeming simplicity, crudeness, and outright primitiveness of the technical solutions applied, the aircraft's rise to its wings was difficult. During the implementation of the flight test program, particular complaints were caused by its spin characteristics, because of which one prototype was lost and two others were seriously damaged. Analysis of the flight incidents showed that the reason lay in the insufficient effectiveness of the control surfaces, which forced the chief designer to subject the entire tail assembly to significant reworking. Accidents and the prolonged struggle with teething troubles delayed the adoption of the aeroplane into service by more than 2 years. And when, at the beginning of 1936, the Swordfish finally reached the troops, against the background of its contemporaries, it already looked, to put it mildly, not too modern, for which it was immediately awarded the jocular nickname Stringbag or Avaska. In general, however, the pilots of carrier aviation spoke of the novelty more positively. The biplane really had qualities to be loved for. The machine had simple and predictable controls, successfully complementing its excellent takeoff and landing characteristics. In this light, it is not surprising that somewhat later, Canada purchased more than 100 multi-purpose aircraft, which were used by this northern country not at all for their direct purpose, but as trainers for the initial instruction of flight school cadets. By the beginning of the Second World War, Swordfish were present on the decks of all British aircraft carriers, forming the basis of their strike capability. In addition, there also existed a float plane modification of the Biplane, for which the hangars of His Majesty's battleships became home. It is interesting that despite the modified landing gear, the possibility of using a torpedo was preserved. But the war, without asking, began in a way entirely different from how the commanders of the world's largest empire had planned. Already on September 17th, after 2 torpedo hits from the German submarine U-30, the aircraft carrier Courageous went to the bottom. And only 9 months later, its fate was repeated by Glorious, shot to pieces by pocket battleships. Together with these 2 ships, about 50 Swordfish also perished. The combat debut in the skies can likewise hardly be called particularly successful. Because of the inexperience of the crews and gross miscalculations of the command, the torpedo bombers failed to exert any noticeable influence on the course of the German landing operation to occupy Norway. For example, on April 11, 1940, 20 biplanes undertook a sudden attack on 3 German destroyers in the harbor of Trondheim. However, all the torpedoes they dropped, due to the unconsidered depth of the water when planning the sortie, buried themselves in the muddy bottom, never inflicting any damage on the enemy ships. However, as it turned out, that was only the beginning. The subsequent battles in the skies of France, where Swordfish were regularly sent with the aim of striking at the Wehrmacht's rapidly advancing mechanized columns, actually demonstrated the complete helplessness of Lobel's creation when faced with modern high-speed fighters. Not infrequently, entire squadrons of string bags failed to return home from their missions. At the same time, off the western and northern coasts of Africa, that is, where enemy fighter activity was reduced to a minimum, the career of the aircraft unfolded quite differently. The first operations in these regions were directed against yesterday's allies, the French, or more precisely, their fleet. And if at Mers el-Kebir it was the artillery of the British battleships that decided everything, with aviation only later finishing off the ships run aground, then at Dakar the opening chords were played precisely by the carrier biplanes. It was they, in particular, that during a series of successive attacks disabled the newest French battleship Richelieu, which predetermined its unenviable fate as an immobile artillery target. The ethical side of the question of firing upon the formally neutral French fleet I will not raise. But it would be foolish to deny that the experience accumulated during Operation Catapult only a few months later made it possible to achieve perhaps the loudest British naval victory of that war. I am speaking, of course, of the unexpected visit of 2 squadrons of Swordfish to the main base of the Italian Navy at Taranto, where in only half an hour 1 enemy battleship was destroyed, 2 others were heavily damaged, along with a heavy cruiser, and the fire that began in the oil storage caused serious harm to the port's infrastructure. Such success was in many ways made possible thanks to the use of modified torpedoes and, of course, the achievement of complete surprise. The results of the airstrike of November 11, 1940 are all the more astonishing if one knows that the attacking side lost only 2 torpedo bombers. A bright page in the biography of this aircraft is also its considerable contribution to the search for and destruction of the German battleship Bismarck. It was precisely Swordfish pilots who, having achieved several torpedo hits, managed to disable the steering of the Steel Giant, making it easy prey for the guns of its pursuers. However, even such a triumph could not overshadow the obvious shortcomings of the string bag, which made its continued use at the front extremely dangerous. This was also understood in London, but the British aviation industry still could not provide an adequate alternative. While the question of purchasing specialized American equipment was being decided, the friendly anachronism, as one well-known test pilot called it, continued to carry out its difficult and dangerous combat service. In the winter of 1942, the torpedo bomber was involved in repelling the breakthrough of the German fleet's battle forces through the English Channel to Germany. In the attempt to destroy the large surface ships of the Kriegsmarine, the British literally threw into the fight everything they had. As it happened, the first to attack was a formation of 6 Swordfish. The fate of this brave detachment was tragic. Never meeting the promised fighter cover, the slow aircraft were quickly shot down one after another during the fierce attacks of the Luftwaffe. According to the German pilots who landed after the battle, the old biplanes fought with remarkable selflessness. Not one of them, even under fire, veered from its combat course. Evidently, it was not without reason that on the sides of the doomed torpedo bombers of the 825th Squadron shone the motto, "None shall stop us." One would think that after such a massacre, there could be no talk of continuing a combat career at all. Yet instead of being sent into well-earned retirement, work was once again found for this pensioner. In the middle of the war, a particular danger to Allied shipping was posed by the wolf packs of German submarines, which had become the true masters of the Atlantic. And it was precisely for fighting them that the simple and reliable aeroplane of Fairey aviation proved useful. In its anti-submarine configuration, the Swordfish Mark II's, the place of the navigator was often taken by a radar set, while the fabric covering of the lower wing was replaced by metal. This latter innovation made it possible to fire unguided rockets. In the arsenal of aircraft flying out on patrol, there were, as a rule, 8 such warheads, equipped with either armor-piercing or high-explosive warheads. A hit from even one such rocket was enough to render an enemy submarine unable to dive for a long time, turning it into a helpless warship. And besides these, the biplane also carried from 2 to 4 depth charges. When circumstances allowed, the string bags from escort carriers operated in pairs with fighters, which attacked slightly earlier, drawing upon themselves the fire of enemy anti-aircraft guns and destroying their crews. The success in this new role was staggering. Losses from submarine attacks dropped significantly, which encouraged the military to go further still and begin converting ordinary merchant ships into makeshift anti-submarine aircraft carriers. These so-called MAC ships had no hangars, and their entire air group consisted of 3 or 4 aircraft parked directly on a wooden deck. The length of the runway was far shorter than standard, so no other machine but the Swordfish could even attempt to land on it, much less take off. Even for the fully loaded biplane itself, in the absence of a headwind, additional acceleration was often required. Needless to say, conventional steam catapults were not installed on such ships. Instead, the solution was found in fitting the string bags with special attachments that allowed the mounting of solid fuel rocket boosters on the tail section of the fuselage, which shortened the takeoff run by a good 100 meters. The next modification, Mark III, was paired with a more powerful engine and received the bulky centimetric radar ASV Mark X, whose radome had to be placed under the belly. This design feature excluded the possibility of carrying torpedoes. However, by the end of 1943, no one, fortunately, was demanding this anymore from the elderly bomber. The results of the Swordfish's work in this role were 25 enemy submarines destroyed. But even more important was something else. By its mere presence, the old-fashioned biplane greatly constrained the actions of Dönitz's wolves, turning each of their attacks into a potentially fatal undertaking. Thus, many hundreds of ships that safely reached port and destination owed their bright future in part to this orthodox aircraft. The last Swordfish rolled off the Sherburne factory line in August 1944. Yet until the very last day of the war, over the boundless expanses of the world ocean, even in its most remote regions, it was not uncommon to see these solitary aircraft flying low over the water. Drawing the final line, one inevitably asks, what kind of aircraft was it really, good or bad? And friends, I unfortunately have no answer for you. On the one hand, the flight characteristics of the biplane quite matched its appearance, meaning they did not look impressive. On the other hand, it must still be admitted that in such parameters as controllability, maintainability, reliability, and simplicity of servicing, the string bag unambiguously surpassed everything that the British aviation industry of that period produced. I am inclined to think that this aeroplane simply once got very lucky to find itself in the right place at the right time. You may agree with me or you may not, but in any case, considering the grand service record of the aircraft, the Fairey Swordfish has rightfully earned its own special place in the Hall of Aviation Glory of Great Britain. Thank you for watching and listening. A special thanks to all who subscribed and left a like. It helps the channel's growth. We will hear each other again very soon, my friends.